Story 1. The November evening had settled early over North Wales, and the A470 stretched before us like a black ribbon through the mountains. Dave and I were returning from a Man United match in Manchester, both of us still buzzing from the late winter despite the exhaustion setting in. The dashboard clock read 8:47 p.m. when Dave suggested we pull over at one of the lay-bys near Blaenau Festiniog. His knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel for the past 3 hours, and I could see the fatigue in his eyes. "Need to stretch my legs," he said, already slowing the car. "Been driving for hours." The lay-by overlooked a dense valley of pine trees, their tops barely visible in the gathering darkness. Snowdonia's mountains loomed beyond, their peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the sky. I stepped out, the cold air biting through my team jacket, and lit a cigarette. The flame from my lighter briefly illuminated our solitude. We hadn't seen another car for at least 20 minutes, and the silence was absolute. No distant traffic, no bird calls, not even the usual whisper of wind through the trees. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was moonlight reflecting off something, but the moon was hidden behind clouds. Above the tree line, perhaps 200 meters up, hovered what I can only describe as a metallic, cigar-shaped object. It was perfectly still, seeming to pulse with a dull silver light that reminded me of Mercury, fluid and somehow alive. The object was massive, at least the length of 2 commercial airliners, but it made no sound. It simply hung there, defying everything I thought I knew about aircraft and the laws of physics. "Dave," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the object. "Dave, are you seeing this?" He was already staring at it, mouth slightly open. "What the hell is that?" I fumbled for my phone, hands trembling slightly as I tried to take a photo, but the screen showed nothing but a bright smear, like lens flare from a street light, except there were no street lights for miles. Each attempt produced the same result, a ghostly streak that didn't come close to capturing what we were witnessing. For what felt like 30 minutes, we watched this impossible thing hover silently over the valley. It moved occasionally, with a fluid grace that reminded me of a fish gliding through water. No sound, no lights, just that ethereal silver glow. The air around us had grown unnaturally still, and I noticed my watch had stopped at 8:52 p.m., though we'd surely been standing there much longer. Then, without warning, it began to ascend. Not like a plane or helicopter, but in a smooth vertical movement that defied physics. Within seconds, it had disappeared over the mountain ridge, leaving behind an atmosphere so charged, it made the hair on my arms stand up. "Well," Dave started to say, but was cut off by a sound that shattered the silence, a deep, mechanical whir that seemed to rise from the valley floor. A black helicopter, unmarked and running dark, burst through the tree canopy like a predator from its lair. It banked hard, following the exact path the object had taken, and vanished over the ridge. The sound of its rotors echoed off the mountains long after it disappeared, as if the valley itself was holding on to the noise. We stood there for several minutes after that, neither of us speaking. My cigarette had burned down to the filter without me taking a single drag. Finally, Dave cleared his throat. "Maybe we should—" "Yeah," I agreed quickly. "Let's go." The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in thought. The car's clock now read 9:47 p.m. Somehow, nearly an hour had passed in what felt like minutes. I might have convinced myself it was all some sort of shared hallucination, if not for what happened 3 months later at Morpha Beach. It was meant to be a simple stargazing trip with my astronomy friends. Sarah, Tom, and I had been planning it for weeks, waiting for the perfect clear night to test out Tom's new telescope. Morpha Beach was perfect. Isolated, dark, with clear skies and no light pollution. The sand was still warm from the day's sun as we set up our equipment, the gentle surf providing a soothing backdrop to our excited chatter about Saturn's rings and Jupiter's moons. We'd been there about an hour when Sarah noticed something odd over the water. I was adjusting my telescope's focus when I heard her sharp intake of breath. "Guys," she said, her voice tight, "what is that?" 3 lights, brilliant white and arranged in a perfect triangle, were moving silently across the bay. They maintained their formation with impossible precision, like points on a solid object we couldn't quite see. No aircraft I knew of could maintain such perfect alignment while moving. As we watched, transfixed, the triangle changed direction and began moving inland. Toward us. The lights grew larger, and still there was no sound, no engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing but the gentle lapping of waves. The triangle passed directly overhead, and I felt a strange pressure in my ears, like being in a plane during descent. The air temperature dropped noticeably, and our breath began fogging in front of our faces despite it being a mild February night. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, all 3 lights winked out simultaneously. The darkness that followed was absolute. I don't remember who moved first, but suddenly we were all scrambling to pack up, hands shaking as we collapsed tripods and grabbed bags. I kept fumbling my car keys until Sarah grabbed them from me and got the door open. Tom left half his equipment on the beach, over 1,000 pounds worth of telescope and camera gear abandoned in our panic. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of 3 white lights, now in a vertical line, ascending rapidly into the night sky. The next morning, when we returned to collect Tom's equipment, we found it arranged in a perfect triangle on the beach, each piece exactly the same distance apart. The sand around the equipment was untouched, showing no footprints despite the damp conditions. I've told these stories a few times over the years, usually after a few drinks when the conversation turns to the unexplained. I'm always careful to say I don't know what I saw. The official explanation for the cigar-shaped object was a weather balloon, and the triangle formation was attributed to military training exercises. But those explanations feel hollow, like trying to force puzzle pieces into spaces where they don't belong. Sometimes, on clear nights when I can see the stars, I find myself watching for unusual movements in the sky, wondering if whatever I encountered is still up there, silently watching. Dave moved to Australia 6 months after our experience, saying he needed a change. Sarah and Tom both sold their telescopes, and me, I still drive that road through Snowdonia sometimes, always slowing down at that particular lay-by, half hoping and half dreading to see that silver glow above the trees again. Because deep down, I know what we saw wasn't from here, and I'm not sure we were meant to see it at all. Story 2. Summer nights were always the hardest for sleeping, especially when you're 10 and the world feels too full of possibilities to waste time on dreams. That particular evening in August 1998, I had convinced Mom to let me stay up an extra hour, promising to spend it reading rather than playing my Game Boy under the covers like usual. The deal seemed fair enough. I had goosebumps, say cheese and die, tough-ish, and the bay window in my bedroom made the perfect reading nook. My room was on the 2nd floor of our suburban home, giving me a clear view over the neighboring houses and into the distance where the city's glow painted the horizon a dull orange. The window seat had these thick cushions Mom had made, decorated with rocket ships and stars. a remnant from my space-obsessed phase the year before, when I'd plastered my ceiling with those glow-in-the-dark stars and insisted on eating freeze-dried ice cream like the astronauts. The street below was quiet, most houses dark except for the occasional blue flicker of late-night TV. My digital alarm clock read 9:47 p.m., its red numbers casting a faint glow across my astronomy book collection. I remember the exact time because I was worried about Mum coming to check on me, knowing my extended bedtime was nearly up. That's when everything changed. I had just reached a particularly scary part of my book when movement in the sky caught my attention. At first I thought it was just a plane. We lived about 30 miles from the international airport, so aircraft were common enough. But this was different. The lights weren't blinking like airplane lights do, and they were moving straight up, not across the sky like normal aircraft. The object was far enough away that I couldn't make out its exact shape, but something about it seemed oval, like an egg standing on end. But it was the lights that made me drop my book onto the window seat. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, or since. Yes, there were the usual colors, the reds, greens, and blues that you'd expect to see on aircraft. But among them were colors I couldn't even name. Colors that seemed to exist somewhere between the ones I knew, like someone had invented new entries for the crayon box. One was sort of like purple, but also like silver, but also like neither of those things. Another reminded me of what it looks like when you rub your eyes too hard and see spots, except it was more real. I remember pressing my forehead against the cool glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The object moved with a purpose, ascending faster than any plane I'd ever watched, but somehow smooth, like it was sliding up an invisible track in the sky. My old binoculars sat on the bookshelf next to my bed, right between The Kid's Guide to Space and a dog-eared copy of The Way Things Work. I'd gotten them for Christmas the previous year, mainly using them to spy on squirrels in the backyard or watch the neighbors washing their cars. In my excitement to grab them, I practically leapt across the room, knocking over a stack of Marvel comics in the process. But by the time I scrambled back to the window, fumbling with the focus wheel, the object had already ascended too high. All I could see through the lenses was darkness dotted with stars, no trace of those impossible colors that had danced across the sky moments before. I sat there for what felt like hours, binoculars pressed against the glass, hoping it would return. My book lay forgotten on the cushion, its scary story no longer seeming quite so frightening compared to what I'd just witnessed. When Mom came to check on me at 10 p.m., she found me still staring at the sky. "Time for bed, sweetie," she said, probably assuming I was just trying to stretch my extended bedtime even further. I wanted to tell her what I'd seen, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear she wouldn't believe me, or maybe it was the strange feeling that what I'd witnessed was something special, something just for me. Instead, I just nodded and climbed into bed, my mind racing with possibilities. The next day at school, I spent art class trying to recreate those strange colors with my paint set, mixing and remixing until Mrs. Peterson told me I was making a mess. But nothing came close to what I'd seen. Even now, 25 years later, I sometimes find myself staring at paint swatches or color wheels, looking for those impossible shades that existed for just a few moments on a summer night. I've thought about that evening countless times over the years, trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my young mind, or perhaps some experimental aircraft from the nearby Air Force base. The logical part of my adult brain wants to dismiss it as the overactive imagination of a kid who'd read too many science fiction books. But sometimes, usually on clear summer nights when the stars are bright, I find myself drawn to windows that face the sky. Part of me hopes to catch another glimpse of those inexplicable colors, to prove to myself that what I saw was real. Because even though I was just a kid, I know what I saw that night was something beyond our ordinary world. Something that showed me, if only for a moment, that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we imagine. I still keep those old binoculars on my desk at home. They're even more useless now than they were back then. One of the lenses cracked and the focus wheel stuck, but I can't bring myself to throw them away. They're a reminder of that night, of those colors that shouldn't exist, and of the moment I realized that maybe, just maybe, we're not alone in this vast universe. After all, some things you never forget, even if you can't quite explain them. Story 3. The first time it happened, I was deep into a late-night Halo session. The clock on my Xbox dashboard read 11:17 p.m., and the house had settled into that peculiar silence that only exists in the hours before midnight. I remember these details with unsettling clarity, because what followed changed everything I thought I knew about reality. Mid-game, something seized control of my muscles. There's no other way to describe it. It wasn't like hearing a noise and turning to look. This was different. It felt as if someone had reached into my brain and pulled a lever, completely bypassing my free will. My head turned toward the window beside my gaming chair, my movements as mechanical as a marionette's. What I saw there still haunts the edges of my understanding. At first glance, it resembled an aircraft, but that comparison falls apart under scrutiny. The object was football-shaped, but even that description feels inadequate. Its surface writhed with patterns that glowed in impossible combinations of green, yellow, and orange. But the colors seemed wrong somehow, as if they were bleeding through from somewhere else. The patterns themselves appeared to be moving in ways that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. The object looked wrong. Not in a threatening way, but in the way that a cube would look wrong to a being that only knew 2 dimensions. It was like watching a shadow of something that existed in 4 dimensions, trying to squeeze itself into our reality. My brain struggled to process what my eyes were seeing, like trying to read a word that keeps changing shape as you look at it. Then came the sound. It started as a low vibration, but quickly became something more, a bone-deep resonance that seemed to emanate from everything around me. My entire body hummed with it, a bass so profound it felt like reality itself was being shaken apart. I reached out to touch my desk, expecting to feel it rattling, but the surface was perfectly still. The disconnect between what my body felt and what my hands told me was real made my stomach lurch. The sound grew until it filled every molecule of air, every cell in my body. It should have woken the whole neighborhood, but when I checked later, no one had heard a thing. The object moved across the sky with deliberate purpose, taking exactly 9 seconds to cross my field of view before vanishing. As soon as it disappeared, the sound cut off, as if someone had flipped a switch, leaving behind a dizzying disorientation that sent me stumbling to bed. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, a hallucination, anything that would fit into my understanding of the world. But 3 weeks later, something happened that made that impossible. I was driving with my friend Mark late at night, taking the back roads home from a movie. We'd actually been discussing UFOs, one of those late-night conversations that usually feel purely hypothetical. I was about to tell him about my experience when it happened again. Mid-sentence, both of our heads snapped to the same exact point in the sky, not roughly the same area, the exact same point, as if we were puppets controlled by the same hand. The movement was so synchronized that it should have been our first topic of conversation afterward. But what we saw next drove everything else from our minds. A light appeared in the empty sky, but calling it a shooting star would be like calling a supernova a match flame. It materialized out of nothing. No gradual fade in, just sudden existence. In less than 2 seconds, it carved a path across half the visible sky before vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. The light didn't streak or fall like a meteor. It moved with purpose, like something piloted. "Did you fucking see that?" I practically shouted, my voice shaking. Mark's response came out quiet, almost whispered. "Yeah." He paused for a long moment before adding, "It was probably a shooting star. But no, I'm wrong. It didn't even look like something from our, time." I wanted to discuss it, to compare notes and confirm that what we'd seen was real, but Mark shut down. "I don't want to talk about it," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I recognized the fear in his voice, not of the object itself, but of what its existence meant for everything we thought we knew about reality. We rode the rest of the way in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. Later, when I tried to bring it up again, Mark would change the subject or make excuses to leave. Within a month, he'd transferred to a different college in another state. We still talk occasionally, but we never discuss that night. Sometimes I wonder about that synchronized head movement, about what force could reach into 2 separate human brains and manipulate them so precisely. I wonder about objects that don't fit in our dimension, about lights that ignore the rules of our reality. But mostly, I wonder if somewhere out there, in dimensions we can't perceive, something is wondering about us too. These days, when I'm gaming late at night, I keep my back to the window, not out of fear, exactly, but because I'm not sure I want to know what might happen if that otherworldly puppeteer decides to pull my strings again. Some questions are better left unanswered, some dimensions better left unexplored. But sometimes, in those quiet hours before midnight, I feel a familiar tugging sensation at the base of my skull, and I know something is out there, waiting to be seen. Story 4. The Orange Lights. It started on what should have been just another Friday night. I was picking up friends for a night out in town, the clock on my dashboard, reading just past 9. The streets were still alive with people heading to pubs and restaurants. The kind of ordinary evening that gives no hint it's about to turn extraordinary. That's when I first saw it. At first glance, it looked like Mars was having an exceptionally bright night, hanging low and red in the sky. "Whoa, Mars is bright tonight, eh?" I said to Jake in the passenger seat. He agreed, and for a moment, that's all it was. Just another astronomical observation on a clear night. But then I saw the second light. I pulled over, killing the engine but leaving the keys in the ignition. Both lights were moving now, not in the steady arc of satellites or the straight lines of aircraft, but in patterns that seemed to defy aeronautics. They danced across the sky, moving up, down, left, and right, with impossible agility. The color had shifted, too. No longer red, but a deep pulsing orange that seemed to glow from within. "Those definitely aren't planes," Jake muttered, his face pressed against the passenger window. No navigation lights, no sound, just 2 brilliant orange orbs performing their mysterious ballet against the darkness. We had to pick up Chris, who lived just a few streets over. When we arrived, he didn't even need us to point them out. He was already staring skyward, along with a dozen other people who had stopped on the street. There's something validating about seeing others witness the same impossible thing. A shared experience that stops you from questioning your own sanity. That's when the third one appeared. It came in lower than the others, close enough that its light cast faint shadows on the ground. As we watched, it ascended to join its companions, their orange glow intensifying momentarily before all three vanished into the infinite black of the night sky. The street fell silent, dozens of witnesses trying to process what they'd just seen. I thought that would be the end of it. One incredible story to tell at parties, one inexplicable night to remember. I was wrong. 2 months later, I was driving home with my friend Mark, who works for the Air Force. The orange light appeared almost directly ahead of us, lower and closer than any I'd seen before. This time, I could make out its shape. A classic flying saucer, like something from a 1950s sci-fi film, but somehow more real, more present. It rotated slowly, its orange glow pulsating in rhythm with its spin. I glanced at Mark, hoping his military experience might offer some explanation. The look of bewilderment on his face told me everything I needed to know. Whatever this was, it wasn't ours. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly, his training and experience rendered useless in the face of something that shouldn't exist. We watched until it too disappeared upward, swallowed by the night. The third encounter happened at the multi-story car park overlooking the city. Sarah and I had gone up there to watch the sunset, and as darkness fell, I saw that familiar orange glow emerge from behind a cloud. After hearing my previous stories, she'd been skeptical, understandably so, but now she sat forward in her seat, all doubt erased by the otherworldly object performing impossible maneuvers above us. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You weren't making it up." We watched as it moved across the sky, eventually appearing to descend behind Mount Carlton, where we'd spent countless evenings stargazing. The mountain silhouette momentarily lit up with that same orange glow before falling dark again. Neither of us suggested driving up to investigate. These sightings have changed me in subtle ways. I find myself scanning the night sky more often, looking for that distinctive orange glow. I've become more attentive to the space above us, more aware of the thin line between the explicable and the mysterious. The skepticism I once held about UFO sightings has been replaced by a sort of humble uncertainty about what we think we know about our world. People often ask me what I think the lights were. Military aircraft, drones, atmospheric phenomena? I don't claim to know. What I do know is that across 3 separate occasions, multiple witnesses saw something that defied conventional explanation. The orange lights moved with purpose and intelligence, performed maneuvers that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, and appeared in the same area multiple times. Sometimes, late at night, I drive up to that car park overlooking Mount Carlton. I sit there watching the sky, wondering if they'll return. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of orange light in my peripheral vision. By the time I turn to look, it's always gone. But that familiar feeling of wonder and unease lingers, reminding me that perhaps we're not as alone as we think. The truth is, I don't need to prove what I saw anymore. Dozens of people across 3 different nights saw the same things I did. Whatever those orange lights were, they were real enough to stop traffic, to puzzle Air Force personnel, and to turn skeptics into believers. Some nights, I look up at the stars and wonder if they're looking back, those mysterious visitors with their orange glow, waiting for the right moment to dance across our skies again. Eyes again, eyes again, eyes again.